Miami University, Higher Education, Expansionism, and Slavery on the Frontier. The expansion of the United States government, culture, and territorial holdings in the early 19th century presented ample opportunities for property ownership, new investments, and financial gain. As more people settled on the frontier, the need for education arrived along with them. Miami University was the second college founded in Ohio and opened its doors to students in 1824. The financial investments in land on the frontier and people held in bondage by the men who contributed to and administered the early Miami University undoubtedly bolstered their affluence. Higher education on the frontier was not untouched by the stain of slavery on America, and even Midwestern institutions became entangled with money and people who derived their wealth from the enslavement of African Americans. The intricate connections of slavery, expansionism, and higher education on the frontier complicated the relationship between Miami University, its administrators, and endowments in the early 19th century. Slavery and freedom in Ohio. Slavery was not only an institution of the South, it was deeply interwoven with the United States economy and had connections to the development of land on the frontier. Ohio gained statehood on March 1, 1803, and while buying and selling enslaved people was declared illegal in the state constitution, slavery itself was not unlawful in the state until 1841. Although men could not engage with the institution of slavery in terms of purchasing or auctioning enslaved African Americans, the laws on free African Americans living in the state were extremely restrictive, which attracted Southerners looking to expand their financial interests. Places where slavery was restricted, such as Ohio, indirectly benefited from the expansion of the peculiar institution because wealth, slavery, and land were inseparable in the early 19th century. These systems worked together to advantage those who profited off of human bondage, even if those individuals were not personally responsible for expanding slavery. Land speculation on the frontier. The U.S. expanded into both the Midwestern and Southern frontiers. While chattel slavery was a more common practice in the South, the economic power and wealth derived from slaveholding and enslaved labor supported the settlement of new lands, whether or not subjugated people came to these regions. Economic pressure drove the country west, but it was the wealthy who benefited from affordable and accessible public land. Historian Adam Rothman states, "Public land was cheap, but not free, and at $2 per acre, the market favored the wealthy." Expansion meant that the wealthy were buying more land on the frontiers and either bringing slaves to cultivate this land or profiting off of land expenditures and reinvesting that money into slavery. Southern slave owners quickly realized that there was money to be made in land speculation and took advantage of the industry with the money they already had from another enterprise, which was human bondage. The close relation of the expansion of slavery and the expansion of the United States and the structure and legislation regarding the purchase of public land served as an advantage to those who were wealthy because they enslaved other humans, and then used that wealth to participate in land speculation. Slavery and land speculation were two entities that were inextricably bound, even on the Ohio frontier. Miami University and endowments. Miami University was an indirect beneficiary of the slave economy on the early national frontier. The university had affiliations with slavery that were discrete yet incontrovertibly existent. By 1809, Miami University secured the land it needed for the establishment of the college, and the state legislature founded the Board of Trustees. One of the first responsibilities entrusted to the newly appointed board was selecting an agent to solicit donations for the construction of the university. The board delegated the Reverend John W. Brown to raise these funds, and by the end of his roughly 2-year journey, he collected $2,500 for Miami. Henry Clay, James Monroe, Paul Hamilton, Thomas Worthington, and Alexander Campbell were a few of the benefactors of the early Miami University that prospered from the labor of enslaved people. Their ties to slavery impacted their place in society and their ability to donate money to the institutions like Miami. The establishment of higher education institutions further complicated the frontier's entanglements with slavery because higher education, slavery, and expansionism were uniquely intertwined as well. In Ebony and Ivy, Craig Stephen Wilder states, "Profits from the sale and purchase of human beings paid for campuses and swelled college trusts. And although frontier universities were certainly not entangled with slavery in the same way as the Ivy Leagues, the profits from slavery undeniably benefited institutions like Miami University." Endowments from D.C. According to the 1810 United States Census, Henry Clay owned around 19 human beings, and 1 year later, when he met John Brown, Clay gave $20 to Miami University, listed in the subscription book. John Brown also received $15 from James Monroe, who was the United States Secretary of State at the time and held 77 subjugated people on his Oak Hill estate. Secretary of the Navy Paul Hamilton enslaved 62 people in 1810 and donated $15 to Miami. And Thomas Worthington, who was a wealthy senator from Ohio, inherited enslaved African Americans and gave John Brown $20 for the founding of Miami in 1811. At least $90 endowed to Miami University originated from people with extensive financial investments in slavery. This amount, equivalent to more than $1,300 in 2020, exhibits the significant monetary support the university gained from the profits of slave labor. Miami University and the Board of Trustees. The early Miami University Board of Trustee members made the early financial and administrative decisions for the university, such as the allocation of funds and the appointment of other administrative officials. The board functioned as the primary legislative body for decisions and resolutions in regards to Miami from 1809 until the college actually opened 15 years later. The board was also responsible for electing the president of the university and elected the first president of Miami, Robert Hamilton Bishop, in 1824. These choices reflect the power the board held to impact Miami University's founding and upbringing in its formative years. Board members with connections to slavery. Though Miami University as an organization did not own enslaved African Americans, the administrators who were influencing the early decisions and administration of the university had extensive relationships with slavery and expansionism. John Tapman, James Steele, and Hugh D. McMillan were just some of the men who led prosperous lives in the early 19th century with varied responsibilities and financial investments. They were members of the Miami University Board of Trustees, slave owners, landholders, and agents of expansionism on the frontier. Though these men were involved with these institutions in unique ways, they personified different aspects of the entanglements of slavery, land, and expansion on the frontier and higher education. This is a partial picture of the 1810 census, which shows John Tapman, a Miami University board member, owning 7 enslaved African Americans. The second picture is a partial picture of the 1820 census, which shows that the Steele family owned 24 enslaved African Americans. In this 1830 census, Hugh D. McMillan owned 24 enslaved African Americans. These census records show Miami University Board of Trustee members owning enslaved African Americans throughout their time as administrators on the board. While some board members were financially invested in slavery, not every trustee personally supported the institution. Charles Anderson graduated from Miami in 1833 and was a board member from 1845 to 1854. He was born in Louisville, Kentucky, but he spent his political career advocating for abolition, supporting the Union, and opposing legislation like black laws. Anderson never owned enslaved people, but his father owned at least 20 slaves during Charles's childhood. He was brought up with the advantages and monetary leverage that allowed him to easily access higher education and pursue a professional career in politics. The entanglements of slavery in early America were so pervasive that even those opposed to the institution still had a stake in its existence. Anderson was wealthy and elite, but he did not go on to use that wealth to subjugate African Americans into slavery, even though the labor of enslaved people directly supported his privilege. The financial advantages possible on the frontier with the investment in land, drew some of the earliest Miami board members to Ohio. These men settled in Ohio because of prospects that were fiscally self-serving and inherently contributed to expansionism in the United States. Tapman, Steele, and McMillan all financially benefited from the institution of slavery in some way and used their wealth to purchase land on the frontier. This wealth ultimately put them in positions of prominence that could have helped them to become Miami board members, where they had extensive influence over the administration of the new college. Although there is no direct evidence that these men used their power on the board to serve their own interests, they had personal and financial commitments to expanding and maintaining land and slavery, even on the frontier. The role of the board members in the Miami administration and their economic ties to slavery were not mutually exclusive. Enslaved labor provided profits to purchase land, which created a clear pathway to Ohio and an authoritative position at Miami University. These men were heavily involved in the oversight of the early Miami and had considerable impact on the decisions and governance of the college, and were irrefutably entangled in expansionism, slavery, and higher education.